Hi class, Professor Brennan back. I'm here and we're going to talk about fundamental concepts of argumentation, part 3. Let's get right to the PowerPoint. We left off, where did we leave off? Talking about propositions. We talked about the difference between fact and value propositions, and now we're going to be talking about policy propositions. Remember, a proposition is an assertion, right? It's an assertion about something. It's an assertion about something that you have to prove it. It's going against the status quo. Okay, here we are for this. Okay, and a little itch right there. Okay, so proposition of policy, the very thing that you are going to be working on in your class as debaters is a proposition of policy. A statement that outlines a course of action to take, right? So we talked about policy as standards of conduct, standards of behavior. That's policy. It lays out exactly how we're supposed to treat people. Think about policy, civil rights policy, or disability policy. Policies that the colleges have around, yes, disabled people, or how to treat people of every race, creed, sexual orientation, etc., the discrimination policy. They all outline not only who's the audience of that policy or who's the population involved in that policy, but also what is the expected treatment of how they should be treated and what kind of behavior that people have to have. So concern is always for the future. So when you do your policy, your argument should start with we should. So remember, the policy, the proposition, is what the affirmative is arguing for. It's a change in something. So you're arguing for something different. It hasn't happened yet. Hence why the concern is always for the future. We should. Think about the argument that's happening right now that Governor Newsom has taken on about, gosh, I want to say it's 2035, or maybe it's even sooner, 2030, that maybe it's 2050, and I should know the exact date, but I don't know, is that the state of California is going to be completely fossil fuel free. We're not going to have cars that he's wanting us to all have electric cars. That is that's a pretty big proposition, don't you think? Considering, what is that, 2050, that's less than 30 years away. But if you're a climate activist and you're aware of climate change, that's not asking a lot, considering what's happening to the climate, right? And if we want people to actually have somewhere to live here on this earth. So again, you could say you get into beliefs, but there are the fact that climate change is happening. Much of the rapidity of it, how quickly it's happening, is human related. Climate change has been happening over the course of this Earth's complete lifetime several times. It's not new. It's happened before. Sometimes it's like been a meteor that hit the Earth, right? The end of different ages, like the dinosaur age. So, but what's happening now is definitely anthropomorphic, meaning it's human driven. It's making it happen faster. It was probably already going to happen, but it's happening faster as a result of human activity, human industrial activity. Okay, so statement should contain both the action needing to be taken and the agent who will do the action. So we need to know what needs to happen in the policy and who's going to do it. Who's responsible for making this happen, right? That has to be clear in your proposition of policy. Keep this in mind, debaters, as we move in that. It's a couple months away, but if we move in that, your proposition of policy is what action needs to be taken and who's supposed to do it. All right, techniques for analyzing propositions. Let's take a look at this. So understanding key terms. Now we're going to kind of get into a little bit of nitty-gritty. So I'm going to give you a proposition. And then we are going to, it's an interesting proposition, so it's one I've had for a while, considering that this is pre-COVID. The proposition is the United States government should fund a program to provide immunizations against contagious diseases for all children living in poverty. Okay. This one, I believe, was just taken from your textbook, I think. And so I'm using that. So how do we define the key? What are the key terms there? Well, who's going to do it? Let's just ask you, who's supposed to take the action? The United States government. Right? The federal government, not the state or local government, but the federal government. And what are they supposed to do? What action is supposed to take? They have to give monetary support. Fund means to create monetary support. Doesn't say administer or operate, right? Create monetary support. What are they gonna fund? A program. A program is known as a program is something that's going to keep, that you're going to establish, that allows ongoing effort, right? It's not something, they didn't say a one-time event. They're saying, let's have a program that handles the situation so it can keep going on and on and on. I'm pointing this out because language is clear. We need a clear understanding of the language. I'll be asking you to do this is for you to define your key terms and understand what those key terms are. We're going to get into that in the future. Okay? And finally, what exactly? They're going to fund a program against immunizations, or to provide immunizations against contagious diseases. So they're going to have to also define in that, what are contagious diseases, right? That's what you want to know. What do we consider contagious? Right now, I don't have COVID-19, but I would put that in there, right? It's contagious. And finally, who's the target? Who's going to get this? Who's going to benefit from this? Children living in poverty. So then we have to discern, what is poverty? How do we define poverty? Children under the age of 18 from families whose incomes fall below the federal poverty standard. Okay, we define all those terms. We're looking at key terms. We have to understand what exactly. You need to understand it. If it's your proposition, you have to understand what is it you're advocating for specifically. You need to be able to answer that. One of the reasons you need to answer it is because in debate, the negative, the opposition, has the right to ask you, when you say program, what do you mean by program? When you say immunizations against contagious diseases, define contagious diseases. They're allowed to ask that. You need to know exactly what you are arguing for. You need to know your key terms. The same way they need to know their key terms. Okay, stock issues for policy propositions. So we're going to look at stock issues. And what does that mean? Stock issues are how we build that argument. They're basically building blocks for arguments. Stock issues are standard, universal, generic issues that are potentially relevant to any controversy. The structure resembles a cost-benefit analysis argument. Okay, the structure resembles a cost-benefit analysis argument. We'll be using that same structure in debate. Stock issues. We have the ill, we call the ill, the blame, the cure, and the cost. Also known as significance, inherency, solvency, and desirability. But I'm going to be referring to them as the ill, blame, cure, and cost. Now let's go back to this for cure means, think of cure, it's solution, solvency, solution. The ill is what's wrong. What's inherent in it? Who's to blame? And what's the cost? The cost of not making the change, and the cost of the change itself. Okay? Knowing those differences. Let's keep going. So when we look at ill, we're talking about the affirmative and the negative. We're going to look at from both sides of those on the ill side. So, right, this is what the problem is. The affirmative has to argue what are the inadequacies in the existing policy. Okay? Their job is to show what's wrong, remember? Against the status quo. they need to quantitatively do this or qualitatively. So they need to point to the number of something statistically wrong, or qualitatively what is wrong with it morally or ethically. Be able to identify that. It's got to be significant. So when the advocate demonstrates that poor children are contracting infectious diseases, when vaccinations could have prevented it, they are demonstrating the ill or the flaw in the current policy. Okay? When they're arguing that they should all be immunized against contagious diseases, they're showing that had they had vaccinations, these poor children wouldn't be getting sick. So the negative, their work, if you're on the negative, is to discredit or reject those kinds of claims, the quantitative or qualitative claims. And by the way, here what they're saying here, those vaccinations should prevent it, they have to prove that. They have to prove that these vaccinations prevent contracting contagious diseases. They will have to prove that in their argument. Okay, we're not under the ill. They just need to make that statement there. So the way that the negative can discredit the affirmative is to say that the numbers the affirmative presenting do not reflect real numbers but are exaggerated forecasts, right? Because because a policy isn't present, they have to forecast what they think is going to happen. And the negative's job is say, they're either making that up, that's not true, they're exaggerating it, etc. I'm going to stop here for a moment. I'll be right back. Okay, thanks for that. So we're going to move on to the next piece of this, and then I'm going to take a break because we're going to have to do the last, we're going to move into one last video after this. So we looked at the ill. Now we're going to look at the blame, also known as inherency. So the inherency points to a deficiency in the policy. What's wrong with that policy, right? In other words, what's wrong is if you're not providing immunizations to children that are poor, is that children are dying or getting sick and their parents are having to pay for sick children when you could just give them immunizations and that wouldn't be happening, right? So they have to address what is the deficiency in the policy. And then they can address what's called the inherency as what is a structural barrier, right? Is there some structural barrier? Doesn't mean that there is one. You might say that maybe the barrier and the inherency in this policy is attitudinal, meaning we have an attitude, especially in this country, about poor people. We believe that anyone can make money, and we also have a belief of upward mobility, that we believe everyone wants to be wealthy or rich or have upward mobility. We don't consider, what if someone's just happy with having a living wage and they don't need material things? Well, we definitely have attitudes that are cultural attitudes in the way we think about poor people. They're lazy, they don't want to work. It's because we have an idea in our mind that we think everybody should want certain things. Think about it. So there's all kinds of ways that this is going to require you to really critically think through your argument and all the possible ways of considering how you might approach it. Don't just take your first instinct with it. Think about it. Think about it. Okay, can address the inherency as absent. So the deficiency is absent and the current state of affairs is deficient. So there's nothing there. There's no policy. That's the problem. The problem is there isn't any policy, and you can't even, there's nothing even to address this issue. All right. I'm trying to see where we're at. So, okay. And then finally, the last thing before I go is advocates attempt to assign responsibility for the blame. They need to assign responsibility for that ill. Okay. Who is responsible? Right? Is it structural, attitudinal, or is there just no policy because we just don't care about poor children? We only care about the kids that have parents who have money. Remember, poor children are in their poor state, not of their making. I mean, there's a lot of ways to think about this. Okay, let's stop there. We'll move on to the next slide, and I'll see you in a minute.